Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Stockton breakout session. I think we're going to get started now. Some folks are still rolling in, but they'll get the introduction here. Please note that this session is being recorded. There will be closed captioning. You can turn that off by clicking the CC icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen if you don't want to see the closed captioning. If you are joining us by phone, please use the *9 to raise hand if you have any questions or if you have any comments throughout the session. That is the only way you will be unmuted to talk. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Quinn. I am the Environmental Justice Enforcement Liaison here at Cal Recycle in Sacramento. I will be your facilitator today. We are so very lucky to have two wonderful speakers today, Elaine Barut Labson and Matt Holmes. Elaine, her pronouns are she, her, hers. She represents the South Stockton with pride. She is a Pinay and a first-generation college student who is currently pursuing her master's in public health degree at Sacramento State. She works as the Health Equity Director for Little Manila Rising. Elaine handles operations surrounding the implementations of Little Manila Rising's programs at the intersections of public health and environmental justice. Elaine oversees Little Manila Rising's asthma mitigation program, DAWN, project, which stands for Decreasing Asthma Within Neighborhoods, #mitigation for liberation. Elaine loves cooking, yoga, roller skating, music, hiking, and is blessed to navigate the world with her husband, Jarrell, and dog, Domino. Our other speaker is Matt. Matt is a history worker who challenges inequality by cultivating more inclusive education, advocacy, and leadership dynamics that redistribute power and create opportunities for underserved communities. We'll have a short presentation here, and there will be some interaction through polls and a Q&A at the very end. So I'll hand it over to you, Elaine and Matt.
You want to say something, Elaine? Go.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for having us. I'm really excited to get us all kicked off with our Stockton work.
Likewise. Thank you, Jamie, for the introduction. Thank you, Elaine, for joining me. For those of you that don't know, we're from Stockton. You guys actually, I was grateful to see Kevin's opening remarks featured some of the Stockton maps that helped bring them at Cal EPA up to speed on this legacy of planned white violence. So we can start with this first slide here. You see some of our standout students standing in front of what's left of the edifice of our community in South Stockton. Jamie, if we can move to the next slide. So here's some of the session agreements that we're going to look at. Everybody should be well schooled on Zoom by now. But if you want to speak or be called on, please use the raise hand feature. If you type something into the chat, Elaine or myself or Jamie will try to help answer that. Or if you just want to bring up an issue in the chat that you'd like to speak on, you can do that as well, but you'll still need to raise your hand so that we're able to unmute you. This shouldn't be that uncomfortable. The topics that we're sharing with you today are really in the resolved column as far as history analysis are concerned, but there's still some folks whose feelings get in the way of understanding these truths. So be prepared to hear uncomfortable conversations. Feel free to challenge. I mean, that's what this is. This is Socratic, but just be prepared to, if you want to spar on these issues, that you're meeting with people that are well versed in this topic. So yeah, be good teachers. Let's seek first to understand and get ready, because this is about the power sharing that's about to define what's left of the rest of our careers. Next slide, please. So you guys, I'll click through this really quick since Kevin kind of sorted this out in the opening. But redlining the housing discrimination across the nation, Stockton wasn't excluded from that. Stockton was a big enough city to have a homeowners loan corporation map, so it was worth it to the industry to plan against us. And so obviously here that targeted across the country, it was really geared towards excluding black communities from wealth creation. But here in California, it also involved a whole host of so-called foreign and mixed race folks. And you saw on the map how industrial areas and the zoned areas were designed to segregate, separate, and undermine communities of color. Next slide, please. So this is what our map looks like. Kevin walked you through it nicely. This whole map is South Stockton. So like these days, this whole area is kind of considered, less than desirable by real estate folks. Even the blue areas are still mostly south of Harding. Stockton even ran from these blue investment areas and, colonized farmland and Delta land to push well-off folks even further away from the city center, which led to a total disinvestment in our city core. But much of this still holds true today. Next slide, please. So you guys know the color grading. I won't spend too much time on that, but it was really designed to be a cheat sheet for realtors to help keep folks with their head start. And so if you don't know the colors, you can read this really quickly. Next slide, please. Kevin went through this, but I just like to call out some of these things. Some of the clauses in here just grotesquely condescending and corrosive. So I've added my own little summaries as to what these clauses meant. We don't need you, but we still need you here to raise our kids and clean up after us. So, they wanted to make sure they still allowed the servant class into their community, keeping in mind that labor theft is what makes America, America. Next slide, please. The language used is really the language of proto-fascist societies, calling people rats and vermin and invaders. This is the language you use and you put on people when you're getting ready to destroy them. Next slide. Really clumsy categories that still really persist in demographics today. I work for Little Manila Rising, which is ostensibly an Asian-led and Asian-owned organization. The Asian label is not entirely accurate or adequate for what we do in South Stockton. My boss, who you're all unfortunate not to have here, would tell you that he feels like he has a lot more in common with Latinx folks who have the same colonizer and the Black folks whose neighborhood he shared with, and that as a speaker I once heard say before, Asia's a big ass place. And assuming that label is satisfactory still is something I think we all need to start talking about. Next slide, please. So this is something that I do think is interesting because we often focus on the red areas and the redlining and the places where we knew the outcome was already a foregone conclusion, but that the yellow areas were really slated for decline, and that they were slated to be further areas of kettling undesirables. And so when you look at these maps, just keep in mind that it's a spectrum of privilege and marginalization, and that you will follow the yellow areas, and they absolutely did decline, and depending on the city that you're in, at different rates. So this is important language for you to check out, and this will be available afterwards, but I won't spend too much time on it. Next slide, please. So, besides getting a house and getting to trade in the bungalow that you bought after World War II for 300% profits, as if that was something that wasn't its own reward. This really impacted everything in our lives in South Stockton and in all the other cities that you can hear from. This undermined our ability to fund schools, educate students. The only investment we got in schools was in over-policing. Those of you that remember the first mass shooting in a public school that happened here in South Stockton, that was a dude that was trying to kill Asian immigrants. He slaughtered numerous students at Cleveland Elementary School, and the investment that we got was over policing that's carried on for 30 years since then. Political disenfranchisement, the zoning of our South Stockton and the districting within city council and with county supervisors all the way up to state and Senate seats continues to skew against consolidating power in South Stockton. Sorry, I've got a light falling down here. And then, of course, once you're in a poor neighborhood and it's an undesirable neighborhood, you can't get a business loan. We all know that even though it was against the law after 1968 for discrimination against home loaning, that didn't change what was in the hearts of the bankers who were still out to get paid. And in our system, somebody's got to be down so that you can be up. So this this de jure, this by law discriminatory practice, really set up the framework for a whole host of de facto discriminatory practices that persist well beyond any of the legal overt discriminatory practices. And of course, that trickles down into the whole host of public health phenomenon that, frankly, many of the agencies on this call still seem unable to chew on. Everybody in here gets to deal with an economic analysis when they're looking at regulatory practices, but for some reason they keep two sets of books like Al Capone, and public health is a separate set of books, where, because they know if you wove them together and you looked at how many of us are hospitalized, how many days of school are missed, and how many of us died 10 to 15 years earlier than the rest of the state, that economic analysis falls apart. So it's disappointing that both kindergarten teachers failed to reach some of our white leadership, and so did economics professors. Next slide. So what I really want to focus on is how this, labeling us and making us vulnerable led to a whole host of additional discrimination. And so Little Manila, which Elaine will get to in a little bit, was the home to the largest population of Filipinos outside of the Philippines. They came here to feed us. They helped build the economy that's made California one of the largest economies in the world. They were instrumental in creating the United Farm Workers movement that you all have heard about through Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, but Larry Itliong was a big part of that. And that all comes out of this nexus here in South Stockton. And that was deemed undesirable. And so there are a couple of ways to get rid of that community. And the two that I'm going to talk about are the Crosstown Freeway and redevelopment. Next slide, please. So if you're not from California, you might not know that freeways are one of our most racist pieces of architecture. They were used to destroy, displace, and segregate communities all across California. And we built freeways like crazy. We built them under the auspices of national defense. You know, we don't have toll roads in the West because we had to drive missiles around all over the state, all over the West, so that the Russians couldn't find them. Defense spending built freeways. That money was allocated to states, and states used them as they saw fit. And so the slide that you see here shows what was once left. Oh, you can't see my marker, but you should be able to see the corridor down the middle of the picture, showing the under construction Crosstown Freeway. And you can see that all those lots once had buildings on them that were destroyed, that were people's homes. They weren't homes in the traditional sense because we had additional de jure discriminatory practices in California. The alien land law forbid Filipinos from owning homes, so they were unable to buy houses even if they had the money to do it. They invested in a lot of fraternal organizations and societies that were allowed to co-own buildings and service centers, and those were all destroyed and displaced by this freeway or separated to the south from the downtown that you see on the right. A little further to the right, you can see the Stockton Channel, which is where a lot of the commerce that points to Stockton and really helped set up the origins of Stockton. That deep water inlet is really what led to the creation of the first English named town in California. So this was the first place when Anglo-Americans showed up and started their colonial adventure. This was the first place that they knew they had to build to feed San Francisco and connect to the world and to get folks up to the gold rush. What you can also see here is a bit of, not exactly a clover leaf, but the merging with I-5 and the freeway extending into the Port of Stockton. The Port of Stockton has become, it's a major economic player here. It's a place where some of our neighbors get jobs, but it's also a place that has become the cluster of pollution sources in South Stockton. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I think we already went over this one. One more slide. This is just the last one that I want to put in here. I think this should have maybe been a few slides forward. The language used to debase and make folks vulnerable is powerful language, and we hear it all the time. We hear it with folks trying to get here from Afghanistan right now. That language has blood on it. And so the description of these these Californians, these newcomers that helped build our state, build our economy, and really the global presence of the United States, to have our Filipino neighbors described as marginally useful itinerant workers is both dangerous and a misnomer. These are folks that that helped our projection of force throughout the world and helped feed our country and build the economy that the entire country still depends on today. Next slide, please. And so this is some of the demolition that you can see here, some of that's happened in more recent times under the redevelopment era. Redevelopment was, a big chunk of money to try to save long abandoned cities. And in Stockton, it was really, it was one of these things where they knew whose input they wanted, right? And so they went out to builders and industry, and 6 votes from influential folks would weigh more than thousands of comments from residents who didn't want their neighborhood displaced or destroyed. And that really leads to the origin of our organization, Little Manila Rising. Next slide, please. And so this is what progress looks like. Our historic structures, the places where our communities were built, our newcomer stories, they're not being conserved, as you'll see in there's really great historic projects all over the country, and you guys are from all over the country. So that when you have historic assets, the one thing you can't buy is time. You can't go back and save something that has our heritage in it. But around here, that wasn't a value of the powers that be. The powers that be wanted to serve, passersby, folks serving the port, folks moving through Stockton on freeways that were built to speed folks right by us, because apparently we were in the way. So this is the current status of the corner of the historic Little Manila neighborhood. Next slide. And so with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Elaine, who can help tell you a little bit about how that redevelopment, destruction of South Stockton triggered the creation of Little Manila Rising.
Thanks, Matt. And so the previous image, the one that had the destruction on it, that was one of the first things that Don and Dylan, our co-founders, came back after they graduated college to, after going out to college, to learn about this rich history in Stockton. Even though their families worked out in the field and everything like that, they didn't really uncover that history until, again, they went out to college, which is a lot of our young people who often leave for college and learn about their histories, specifically around Stockton's history. And so when they came back home and saw the destruction of Little Manila, they felt that it was such a pivotal thing for them to engage in activism to save what was left of Little Manila, the community that was rich, as Matt mentioned, which was home to the largest Filipino population outside of the Philippines from the 1920s outside to the 1960s. And once they came back, it was no longer a community that was once there. They were displaced out, except for maybe one family, which is a family of mine. But other than that, this whole community, as Matt mentioned, was up for eminent domain. There wasn't any investment since a lot of the redevelopment that was happening in Stockton. And so in order for them to save a community, they ended up doing 3 community charrettes, got the community and empowered them to face the city and create a redevelopment plan to turn Little Manila into a place that could be really reflective of the community. Next slide. And even after creating Little Manila Rising and being able to fight the city and turn that into a historic preservation site, even after 20 years of doing historic preservation, ethnic studies, youth development, advocacy, and really putting ethnic studies at Stockton Unified School District and really making it pivotal, specifically Dawn's work with the Filipino immigrant story. We still have a lot of challenges of just being able to do our mission, which is historic preservation, right? And we lost one of the buildings recently, and it was like really, really unfortunate. The work speaks a lot more louder, but knowing that having a physical place to do community work is somewhat hard to do when you're right next to a crosstown freeway. We were thinking of how could it be possible if we could repurpose this area, but we have that crosstown freeway. When we were working with Green Line Institute, and thanks to greenlining the hood, we found out that the Little Manila Historic Site was the 99th percentile for asthma rates, pollution burden, and that's because of the mobile sources, pollution sources, and of course, the Port of Stockton that is close by. Next slide. And so I really wanted to spend some time on this quote from Dawn. It is my hope that the love, respect, and commitment we feel for our historic community runs deeper than anything that can divide us. Little Manila will always be in our heart. We see Little Manila as a symbol to gateway symbol to South Stockton. And so a lot of the inequities and disparities that we often see are more primarily in South Stockton. Of course, that's due to poor public policy decisions that created the inequities we see today. Next slide. What we found out through the work of being engaged in environmental justice, last year, Stockton was ranked #1 in California and 45th in the nation. And more recently with the reports, we are now #2 and 66th in the nation. But the reason why we really pivoted into environmental justice was because we lost Dawn to an asthma-related incident. She was a South Stockton born and raised, hella badass warrior, an activist who has done so much for our community. And it was a huge loss for our organization, for our people. And it's not just her story that made our shift, but knowing that it's other folks who are living in South Stockton who are breathing that same air, who are developing asthma symptoms, other inequities and disparities that have come to it. And so it shifted our work into environmental justice. Next slide. And so from the work of our AB 617 work this whole entire past year, which I know Matt has quite a few comments around that, but it also angled our work to dive into more into public health, specifically asthma mitigation work. And so we were able to get a grant from Sierra Health Foundation to create our Decreasing Asthma Within Neighborhoods, an ode to Dawn, and be able to do a home mitigation service. Next slide. And so with this overview of our program, so with the intention of being able to see really historic preservation, environmental justice, and public health at the intersection of being able to address the issues of our community who are facing asthma conditions, we want to empower our folks specifically and intentionally calling them our community advocates to mitigate their asthma, but also empower them to engage in social justice and other advocacy points to also challenge what's challenge the inequities that they are facing as well. We really see this as a holistic model. It's not just like seeing environmental justice, public health, all in a silo, but really how can we bridge all of these together and know that it really takes a whole entire community and village for us to address this need. Next slide.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and just jump back up what Elaine was just saying. You know, it's really tough to save buildings when the people around them are dying. And it's really tough to do a Filipino-focused cultural institution when all your neighbors are somebody else because they've been intentionally displaced. And this has become the place where we, you know, mothball undesirables. So, you know, we're absolutely here to work with and support everybody in South Stockton. We only happen to be a Filipino-led organization. And so we're all in this together, and we're also, we're not scared of mission drift. You know, we realize we're one of the organizations with capacity to address multiple issues, because the truth is when you depress an area for so many years and so many decades, you know, your roster gets pretty thin, right? There's a lot of people that have left South Stockton. That's what success looked like for people for many decades was, did you get out? And so we're trying to fight that by giving them a reason to come back. And we've got challenges to face. You know, these are all double-edged swords that you see on your screen here. This is the cluster of mobile source pollutions that are only located in South Stockton, and we're all living in and around them and begging them to knock down their dust, et cetera. Next slide. It's not just mobile sources, though. We're also where they've clustered all the stationary sources, whether or not they have anything to do with the transportation facility. So, you know, you can see DTE Stockton on there. We burn all of California's wine grapevines. You know, we don't grow any grapevines in South Stockton, but this is a politically vulnerable place where they can drive all that stuff, set it on fire, and generate energy nonstop for PG&E, whether we need it or not. So it's not a peaker plant. It's not an emergency fire up. It really is to help a wealthy industry get rid of its waste at the expense of our bodies. You can also see, well, there's a whole host of things that I could tell you about, but this is a familiar story to most of you on this call. Next slide, please. So despite all of these mobile sources and stationary sources, this is the effort that's been made to understand those sources. We've got a self-reporting regime in California where people grade their own report cards. You know what kind of grade you get when you grade yourself. There's no community oversight. There's no transparency in those reports. So we really do need to monitor people. You can trust your permit holders, but you also need to verify that they're telling you the truth. We've had multiple instances this year where reported emission levels are not accurate. We've even had permit holders tell us to our faces higher emission levels that are in their permit, that are in their reports. So in my opinion, the permitting regime is broken, and it's time that we start instrumenting everybody so that we know the truth. And the truth is we're going to have to be the ones to do that. So next slide, please. So the last one was the institutional monitoring, but we know that we have to do it ourselves. Next slide. Unfortunately, we're starting from behind. We lack the resources. Like, take a look at what a resource community can do in buying its own off-the-shelf monitoring equipment. This was Stockton just 3-4 months ago. 2 of those sensors are ours. They were provided to us by Central California Asthma Collaborative. There was no citizen science air monitoring happening in the worst air basin in California because it's tied to wealth. So we're working on that. We've got multiple proposals out. We've managed to use our partnerships and the work through AB 617 to bring in the academic partners that we need, the scientific sector partners that we need. And so we're going to address this dearth of monitoring in South Stockton. Next slide. And so that's the idea behind Stockton Skywatch. This really is a feature for us to provide Elaine's asthma participants with information that they can make a choice on. The regulatory world is way too after the fact. The public agencies have to go through so much QA, QC that by the time they tell you what's in your air, you've already breathed it in and already been poisoned by it. So we're creating a distributed remote sensor network that will allow us to, we don't have to go through QA, QC. We're going to make sure that we're as careful as we can, but we're going to use the precautionary principle to warn people when it's time to protect themselves, when it's time to go indoors. There's nobody around here that's telling an elementary school principal that they should have recess inside, and they don't have any information to make a decision on that. Going outside and looking at the sky isn't how we should make these calls. So we're going to give people reliable information in real time so that they can make informed choices and protect themselves. Next slide, please. Yeah, we got the poll. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elaine and Matt, for going through the history of Little Manila Rising and the racist practices that still exist in Stockton today. We're actually going to do some polls right now with the audience. Oops, sorry, I have it on the wrong one. So you all can join at slido.com and enter the numbers 042513. Or you can bring your phone camera up and get the QR code here. It will take you directly to this polling site. Again, slido.com 042513. The question here is, do you or someone you know have asthma? And Elaine and Matt, if you have any comments, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, this poll, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This poll strikes me that, asthma is normal here. Everybody thinks it's normal for everyone to have a life-altering condition. And we're trying to challenge that.
Yeah, and I just want to plug in that something that we learned is that the county no longer offered any asthma services. And so there are only like a few organizations that are doing some asthma mitigation services. And it's really critical, as this is a huge need in our community, that we are looking for the folks who need the services most. So if you happen to know anyone, please send them our way, specifically in the South Stockton region.
Yeah, normalizing these conditions, and then also the bigger issue of alienating people from healthcare and institutional relationships really feeds into folks not coming for help and toughing it out and really degrading their life when they shouldn't have to. Because make no mistake, this condition is a result of people throwing their garbage in the sky and not paying to cover it, right? So our bodies are their profits.
Yeah, and just to add on, we use a community health worker model to help bridge that, because there is a lot of mistrust and misinformation that happens with the health system itself, and it's difficult to navigate. And so being able to bridge that again for our community to be able to utilize these services.
Thank you too. I'll forward to the next question. Do you have a whites only homeowners covenant in your deed? This is for those that own homes.
And just as those results are rolling in, I'm sure a lot of people have read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. I highly recommend it. It talks about how normal this practice was, and that's what happens when the federal government institutionalizes a practice. That's what makes things normal. You know, these are everywhere, and people are shocked to find out that they're whites. You know, they're shocked to find out that this is buried in the paperwork. But you know, this kind of evidence isn't really necessary if you believe your own eyes, right? This is not a white planet. But if you look around and you happen to be in Montana and there's only white people around you, that's not an accident, right? Or if you're on one side of town and it happens to be whiter and wealthier, you can believe your own eyes. You don't need to run one of these data fool's errands that me and Elaine have to run to prove that we're worth saving.
Thank you, Matt. Next question here. This one is an open-ended question. What are other ways in which whites-only housing was created and perpetuated? Got quite a few answers rolling in.
I'll just upvote the school district one. We have 4 school districts in Stockton. Stockton Unified is in the Red Line neighborhood. We got an old whites only community in Lincoln. And then when real estate developers had to feed our sprawl, we brought in neighboring town school districts because everybody knew you can't sell a house in Stockton Unified. It was like this most obvious truth that everybody submitted to.
While we let this poll continue, you all can continue typing in your answers. There's actually one more activity that I'd like you all to type out in the chat here. Type out your own experiences with redlining or environmental racism in the chat. While the attendees are doing this, Elaine and Matt, if you have any, or actually, I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat. If anyone wants to raise their hand to ask Elaine or Matt a question, please do so right now. And again, if you are on the phone, you have to press *9 to raise your hand.
You know, while we're waiting for those to roll in, I mean, I think this should be an uncontroversial truth, right? This is something that we all need to push into the resolved column and be ready to do something about. You know, history isn't that foggy. Inequality isn't that difficult to understand. You know, we know who was enslaved and we know who did it. So playing dumb is something that, as we do that, we heap this problem on the next generation. So it's high time that we, you know, confronted these histories. We put people's unfounded feelings about being attacked aside, and we do something proactive to address it, because something proactive was done to create this inequality. So it's not going to go away on accident, right? Yeah. Thank you, Elaine. Amnesia is toxic, and white folks got it.
Yeah. I'd like to have Maria please unmute Susan. She has her hand raised.
Hi, I don't know, am I supposed to on the video too? Hi, I am actually attending this from Rhode Island, East Coast. And I am working on a nonprofit organization called the Coalition Center for Environmental Sustainability. And it's amazing how much of you presented. It's mirrors what I see in Providence, Rhode Island. Southside Providence has the second highest children asthma rate in the state. I don't know the national level. My question is, yes, it is painful history, and I'm glad that it's coming out. We are learning about all this, but what can we do about it going forward? I mean, I see that what you mentioned about, especially in your monitoring air quality in your communities, that since you don't get that much funding from federal level and state level, you're gonna have to rely on your local resources. Unlike that, in Providence, you know, it is that we have a huge involvement with the EPA and DEM and all the things like that. Yet we still face the same thing. You know, funding may be there, but infiltration of funding or allocation of those resources is stuck in so-called white supremacy system. So I was just wondering, you know, like what suggestions you have. I mean, your story is very painful yet very inspirational. So if you would share some tips.
Yeah,
you know.
you're in a cool town, and we have good friends there. So there's a local nonprofit in your town that has really broken down the connection between redlining and green infrastructure assets, right? So where the red lines were is where your heat island effect is. It's where your hospitalization rates are, and so it really does come down to finding money to address those issues. I mean, for starters, getting folks indoors and home ownership, or at least shelter access. But then, you know, cities all the time spend money on one side of town and not on the other side of town. So the data that Kevin and his team pulled together here, they make it really clear. These dollars were taken out. It's time to put those dollars back in. So you have a climate safe neighborhoods mapping tool for Providence that's really cool. There's a young man named Kufa Castro out there who I'd be happy to connect you with, who knows this truth. And they run urban forestry program, park building program, local sustainable food programs. You know, there are solutions, and there are people that you can support. The real challenge is, how do we get the public agencies to cede power to those community-based organizations?
Absolutely agree on sharing the power here. I have one other question from Anna. Maria, would you mind unmuting her, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Leasing. I'm actually an immigrant from the Philippines, and I work as Governor Inslee's senior energy policy advisor here in Washington State. And we actually, I think there's a ton that government can and should be doing to step up on environmental justice. We actually recently passed our HEAL Act, which is Healthy Environment, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's our environmental justice bill. And it essentially, it sets up in a new environmental justice council to make sure that we have meaningful engagement and representation from EJ advocates around the state. And they are actually in partnership with the state agencies responsible for completely overhauling how we approach all of our climate and environmental policies in the state and all of our programs. And we have also a health equity map that identifies where we have higher concentrations of air pollution. And we actually have a new law in the books too that requires us to put 40% or actually 30% of our 30 to 40% of our investments in climate to overburdened communities, plus another 10% for tribal communities, and doing that in partnership with the EJ Council to help and environmental justice advocates and community organizations to inform the way we're doing work, the way that we are approaching even how we design our programs, how we administer grant funding, the level of bureaucracy we make people jump through, and making it inaccessible through kind of just very burdensome processes. And really just doing a complete overhaul of every piece of government action, policy, and program in order to better serve and actually center frontline communities.
I'll just clap to that. I mean, you really got to the crux of it, which is, you know, the traditional institutions aren't going to solve a problem that they created, right? The master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And so ceding that power is a lengthy process of really investing in community leadership. These community advisory committees have been pat on the head, rubber stamp things for a long time. It takes a lot of work to really give the time and resources. You know, you got to pay people to show up. If your agency wants community input, it's really gross for 6 of you to sit on one side of the Zoom call and get paid while you sort of carve out information from low-income communities of color that have bigger problems than your work plan or your annual deliverable or the latest flavor of the month out of government. You really need to hand over the work planning. And this is the key thing, community-driven governance. And there's no such thing as leadership or management without having control over the budget. So participatory budgeting, it's not wizardry. It's not magic. It's thank you. I see Elizabeth Moses dropped in the Government's Alliance on Race and Equity. There are lots of toolkits out there blooming that will show you how to give power to the people you're trying to help. Because we can't keep satellite bombing solutions on people.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize what Matt was saying. The community voice is really important as it is, and it should be prioritized at the forefront. But as Matt, everything echoing what Matt said.
Cannot agree more with what both of you are saying. So it is actually time to return back to the main session. I'm sorry, Janet, I have your question saved and we'll send it to Matt and Elaine so they can respond to you. But please return to the main session with the link in the chat. We'll see you back there. Thank you so much, Elaine and Matt and everyone for joining.
You bet. Hi, Janet. Nice to see your face.
Hi, everyone. In case you didn't hear, please click the link in the chat to return back to the main session. Thank you.
I was just going to stay here and talk to you guys real quick. We had some
Yeah.
cool people on that session.
Yeah, I did.
Mustafa Ali was on there. He's the EJ in action guy from the old Obama administration. He used to help us with groundwork stuff. So it's cool to see them. I mean, you know, this thing about Stockton really is emblematic of lots of people's issues. It really is a case study. And so hopefully our reparations work will be seen as a lab.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so sorry I had to rush you all at the end. Wait, Matt, sounds like you actually know Janet. She had a question. Yeah, if you have time to respond to her later through email or something, she had a question about where is Stockton in the AB 617 process, and do participants feel it is gaining any traction? I actually really want to hear your thought on that, because I don't work on AB 617, but I hear about it.
I think she knows the answer to that. You know, so Janet and I were on the community steering committee in Richmond together. And so our status update here in Stockton is that, you know, there's lots to be happy with and lots to be pissed about. You know, it's a half-baked cake, and they didn't know how to let go of power. That's the truth. And the way they set it up, they gave all the power away when they gave all the money to Valley Air District, which, you know, does some things really great, but also has a deeply problematic history.
Correct.
So, you know, I have a brother-in-law who I don't give extra money to because I've known him for 22 years. And, you know, that CARB just gave this money away with no power to provide oversight was just a cartoonish failure on their part. We sat there and had every CARB board member say, my God, give the money back. We don't have any authority. We're really sorry. And then we had our own Valley Air representative to CARB abstain because our public health chair was too afraid to stand with the unanimous CARB and the unanimous community steering committee, because she was worried that the other Valley Air board members who are meeting right now would retaliate against her. And so this young woman of color with a PhD in public health,
daughter of immigrants, farm workers specifically, who had so much San Joaquin Valley rooted in herself.
Yep. She sold us out because she wanted to please other people. And so her character was damaged. She should probably resign her seat. She's no longer effective on that board because she's in a fighter's chair, right? And when people offer you a job, you want to be the director of EJ at CARB, you're in a fighter's chair. You better be ready to tell people something uncomfortable. You're not a colluder and a collaborator. And a lot of these people, they're trained to collaborate. We're all trained to get along, get out of college. Everyone's point is valid. Not when one of your fellow board members tells you Trump is right, rake the forest. That guy's a fucking idiot, right? So somebody needs to tell him that. But if you're in a fighter's chair, you got to fight. You want to go collaborate, go open a yoga studio.
Gosh, that is so freaking disappointing.
Yeah. They took $5 million away from Stockton because we wouldn't give it to the port that has its own damn money, that wouldn't show up to a meeting after 16 months with us and take us seriously. And they were making us spend it on something that didn't even match what they were doing, because Valley Air doesn't know anything about mobile source pollution. But they just went in the budget and said, you're going to give $2 million to a marine bonnet. And we're like, well, that doesn't work with bulk stuff. Why are you being obstructionist? Well, because this is stupid and you didn't think it through. And $2 million could get every poor person into a used electrical vehicle who's going to be left behind in electrification, or could pay for all of us to have free dumping at the Republic Services site. Because you know what happens when you drive to the dump and it's expensive? You turn around and you throw it out.
Yep.
And guess whose neighborhood you throw it out in?
South Stockton.
That's right. So it's the same deal in Richmond. Everybody from Berkeley's home renovation and kitchen renovation is in one of my goddamn parks. because they pay somebody to drive it to the dump.
Yeah.
Public services, if there's a single piece of concrete in there, charges them $300, and they go, well, I already got the money. I'm going to turn around and throw it out in a park.
Mhm.
So
Gosh.
yeah, it all trickles downhill.
I'm so sorry if the question raised your blood pressure
No, no,
levels a little bit there. And thank you for just educating me on this, just because I have not been involved. Cal Recycle sadly has no role at AB 617, and
Yeah.
I wish we did.
But crazy is landfills. I don't know how Cal Recycle overlaps with any of those, but they're major sources of PM.
We regulate landfills, which was why I was like, it's a huge pollutant. Why are we not part of the AB 617 process?
Totally.
Because it still contributes.
Well, Valley Air implemented AB 617 in Stockton and never bothered to work with the Council of Governments, who is the lead planning agency for all transportation facilities. You know why? Because they don't regulate mobile sources. They're just like making up half of their budget for mobile sources. So there's a reason why we've separated pollution into two categories. It lets people point at each other. And there's a reason why we have different air districts in the Bay Area and Los Angeles and the Central Valley. It's regulatory redlining, and that should be our next webinar.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
It's all right. We know and we name them, and so
yes.
At least nobody's. At least we're not. At least I'm not playing dumb anymore. So that's the satisfaction I have.
Yeah, hoping that Chanel, the new EJ director at CARB, is actually speaking up for you all and being a challenging them all a lot more than they have been challenged all these years.
We hope so too. We definitely are deeply engaged, but you know, their CARB is problematic.
Correct. Big agency with a lot of money and never sharing the power, because it's been that way for years, and why not continue that way? I mean, sorry, I'm not saying I agree with their process, but
I like where it was going. I had the paint baroness agree with me, who's a CARB board member. You know what I mean? Like the literacy on the board has definitely has bumped up in recent years. And so, you know, we'll see. I mean, it's the Office of Community Air Protection that needs to show up for us. And they have formally instructed staff to sit on their hands and not give communities information unless they ask for it. And so, you know, non-disclosure is not the foundation of a powerful relationship.
No, it's like you'll never gain trust that way.
So yeah, Jamie, there's a big conference for this at the end of September, where all the CSCs are going to come together, and it's basically going to be a truth-telling session on the different air districts. And
what's a CSC? I'm so sorry.
Community Steering Committee. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Acronyms.
The thing that they were pretending to empower.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and they did, but not in the way that they thought.
Yeah. Am I allowed to like listen in on that, or is that solely just for you all?
Well, it was supposed to be solely for CSC members, but I made them include community air grantees who aren't necessarily in 617 communities, and then all state agencies should be able to be there, and that's why I have the Attorney General's office coming as well, because we need adults in the room with you know, with
the whip.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, you should be able to come there. I'll share the link with you.
Oh, thank you. I'll be a fly on the wall. I won't cause trouble unless I feel like I need to.
I want to share. I'll share with you, Jamie, the map that was created by my buddies at PSE Healthy Energy, physicians, scientists, and engineers, for health